Hello everybody and welcome to the UCL Comparative Literature. My name is Florian Mussgnug. I teach on the Comparative Literature program. So for this taster session, I wanted to just give you an idea of how you could put very different texts together and how you could begin an analysis of these texts. And I've chosen to position myself in relation to a theme which probably is on everybody's mind at the moment, which is, of course, the idea of the pandemic or the health crisis, which is not just a contemporary concern, but is also, as I'm sure you know, a very, very large literary and cultural theme, which can take us back right to the beginnings of literature. So I've chosen three texts which we will read together, and I will ask you to reflect on these texts. All you need in order to be able to join this activity is a piece of paper and a pen. I won't tell you which texts they are. So the first exercise, as I read them to you, as I read these quotations to you, I would like you to think whether you recognize these texts. If you don't recognize them, I would ask you to imagine very roughly when these texts might have been written. Okay, so we start in random order with our first example, and I'll read it to you. So this is example number 1. Let me see. Sighs of woe now became familiar to me, and were I to tell all of anguish and pain that I witnessed, of the despairing moans of age, and the more terrible smiles of infancy in the bosom of horror, my reader, his limbs quivering and his hair on end, would wonder how I did not, seized with sudden frenzy, dash myself from some precipice, and so close my eyes forever on the sad end of the world. But the powers of love, poetry, and creative fancy will dwell even beside the sick of the plague, with the squalid and with the dying. A feeling of devotion, of duty, of a high and steady purpose elevated me. A strange joy filled my heart. This is our first text. Do you have any idea of when it might have been written? Please take notes. And we move on to our second example. Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason." "Skin for skin," Satan replied. "A man will give all he has for his own life. But now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." He replied, "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. You may have recognized this, and here's our third and final text. There was a small television mounted above the film development counter, showing closed-captioned news. G-Van drifted towards it. Health Canada was confirming an outbreak of the Georgia flu. They weren't releasing numbers at this time, but there had been fatalities, and more information would be forthcoming. there were suggestions that Georgian and Russian officials had been somewhat less than transparent about the severity of the crisis there. Officials requested that everyone please try their best to stay calm. Jivan's understanding of disaster preparedness was based entirely on action movies, but, on the other hand, he'd seen a lot of action movies. He started with water, filled one of the oversized shopping carts with as many cases and bottles as he could find. There was a moment of doubt on the way to the cash registers, straining against the weight of the cart. Was he overreacting? But he was committed. He'd decided. Too late to turn back. The clerk raised an eyebrow. Right, so I hope you took some notes. I will now tell you which texts these quotations were chosen from. So quotation number 1 is from Mary Shelley's The Last Man, which was published in 1826 and which is considered the first secular novel to describe an end of the world scenario. So the first novel in which we find a book-length description of a pandemic which isn't described in the work of fiction as an act of divine justice. Right? So we're at the very beginning of the 19th century, and we're after the big events that brought Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley and Lord Byron to Italy, the so-called second generation Romantics. Byron and Shelley are dead at this point, and Mary Shelley has returned to Britain and writes this book, The Last Man, as an elegy, as a kind of sort of sad and regretful look back to the period when she and her friends were young and were experiencing this extraordinary moment of collective energy and creative vigor, which you also find expressed in the text. Something which is very characteristic of this text as well is the focus on the first person narrator and very much the direct address to the reader. You don't find this in our second text, which I think is the text that you will probably have recognized, or many of you will have recognized. That's the famous book of Job in the Bible, the probably oldest book of the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament, and a book which very famously influenced numerous more recent writers. It inspired Goethe's Faust. It prompted Alfred Lord Tennyson to say that the Book of Job was the greatest poem of all ancient and all modern times, and the pact with the devil is very much still a trope which you find in contemporary fiction. So this is the passage in which God and Satan discuss whether Job will renounce God, whether he will curse God, whether he will still show gratitude towards God if he is punished with illness. Any idea which period we might be in? I told you this is probably the oldest part of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Scholars tend to think that it was written about 600 years before the birth of Christ. We call this the 6th century BCE, so before the Common Era. What do you notice here? You don't have a narrative which is focused on a particular character. You don't have a first-person narrative. You also have a very different narrative structure. Right? You will have recognized perhaps that this is a biblical text because I haven't given you a page reference, but I've given you a reference to the chapter and the verses. And our last text is from a very recent book, Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, which is a rather wonderful and engaging description of a pandemic. And Jivan in this story is one of the first characters to understand that this Georgia flu, which they talk about, might be much more serious than most people seem to suspect. Most people in Toronto seem to suspect at this point. And much of the early part of the novel is indeed about sort of how different people respond to the awareness that something terrible might be happening, that this outbreak might affect them, and how people are prepared, and then subsequently whether this preparation helps them or not. And something which you notice in this, if you had to put a date to this, you will notice that there's this reference to action movies, of course, which in fact situates this text in the context of our contemporary awareness of catastrophe as something which we already recognize, not through personal experience, but as a very typical feature of genre cinema or genre literature. Many of you will have had this, I think, uncanny experience that as things were, developing, you felt, oh my God, we're just in the middle of some kind of sort of dystopian novel. And Emily St. John Mandel in this book, Station 11, captures this eerie sense of an awareness which precedes the actual event very well in the first part of the novel, right? So I've given you a violent yoking together of disparate things, and I have shared with you some of my ideas of how these texts can be compared. There are many, many other details that you may have spotted. If you would like to sort of follow this up, please go back to the quotations and write down any further details that you spotted that have allowed you to position these texts culturally, chronologically, that you think would allow you to compare them in interesting ways. And if you'd like to continue this conversation, you're very welcome to contact me by email, share your ideas. Meanwhile, take care, enjoy some good books. This is a great time to read, and I look forward to seeing you. Bye.